Dr. Joanne Martin, founder, along with my late husband, Dr. Elmer Martin, of the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum, America's first Black History Wax Museum. As a part of our learning series, I am happy to present to you the theme for this presentation, Being Literate, Being Free. In this presentation, we will talk about why being literate meant being free. When we talk about being literate, we're talking about the power of learning to read, to write, and to gain information. And that in and of itself was a way to seek and find freedom. We will talk about those many brave individuals, those enslaved people, those free blacks who lived during the slavery era, and the many people who fought for education for an enslaved people. We will talk about who they are and why their cause was important. We can start with our exhibit here on the mask, the man in the iron mask. You may not be able to see it, but his hands show that he has 2 fingers missing. To have someone maim you because 1 finger meant that you would learn to read, and 2 fingers missing meant that you had learned to read and to write. I tell kids that if someone was willing to maim you, to harm you in that way, there must have been something very, very important about literacy, the ability to read, to write, and to seek education, to seek information. There must have been something about this thing called education that would have people who would not only enslave you, not only treat you as cruelly as you see here depicted by this man in the iron mask, but who would attempt to stop you from learning to read, learning to write, learning to seek education, learning to seek information. So we will focus on the ways in which being literate meant being free. Frederick Douglass, the powerful orator, said that he felt and heard the trump of freedom by learning to read. That reading gave him the power, understanding what freedom meant. But he also knew that there was a danger in learning to read and to write. Frederick Douglass, as a little child growing up in Maryland, in Baltimore, would sneak in as his mistress, his white mistress, the woman who owned him, would be teaching her son to read and write, teaching him his lessons. And Frederick Douglass would try to hide himself away and listen and learn. And one day, his mistress said, "Frederick, come on in and learn with us. You don't have to stand there. Come in and learn what we're learning, what my son is learning." And so Frederick Douglass, from that moment on, would join the lessons as his mistress would teach her young child to read and to write. That was a dangerous thing. That was a criminal offense. That was a crime. His mistress could have been fined, possibly jailed, for teaching an enslaved person to read or to write. Frederick Douglass himself could have been jailed and probably killed by learning to read and write. If you knew how to read, if you knew how to write, you could write a pass for yourself and run away. You could pose as a free person with papers that free people had to carry with them. So there was indeed a danger in teaching an enslaved person to read and to write. But Frederick Douglass, feeling the trump of freedom as he called it, through learning to read and to write, was willing to take and bear that danger. Sojourner Truth, next to him, was a person who was duped into believing that her slave master was Jesus. She was a very religious person, but she believed that her slave master was Jesus. When her slave master sold her son into slavery and sold him away from her, that was when she realized that Jesus would never have done that, and therefore he could not be Jesus. But then she became involved in what we would call a cult, and began to believe that the white cult master, cult leader, was Jesus. And when the federal government came in and were going to arrest the people in the cult, they pretty much pointed the finger of blame at Sojourner Truth. And so she understood that, again, Jesus would never have done such an evil act to her. And so she said that she wanted to learn to read and write because she wanted to be able to read the Bible. That was the reason that many black people wanted to learn to read and write, to be able to read the Bible. She said, and then therefore she could learn the truth for herself. But she said if she did not learn to read and write, then she wanted the Bible to be read to her only by children, because children were pure of heart and would speak the truth. But they both understood that being literate meant being free. Thaddeus Stevens grew up in poverty. He grew up being bullied because he had a disability. And he knew what it was like to have to fight for food, have to starve and not be able to go to school. All of those things that were denied people who were victims of poverty and a lack of education. So Thaddeus Stevens fought to make his way into the world. He was able to go to college. He was able to become a wealthy lawyer, all because he was a person who worked hard and understood what it meant to use education and to use opportunity to try to advance in the world. And so for that reason, Thaddeus Stevens became a person who fought against slavery, who felt that enslaving people was a system in which, and a condition in which, white men of privilege were willing to take advantage of others in the same way that someone had attempted to take away his opportunities because he was poor. He spent much of his life, once he left the Philadelphia legislature, the Pennsylvania legislature, then he became a member of the House of Representatives, a congressman, a U.S. congressman. And his fight was against slavery. His fight was for free public education. It was through Thaddeus Stevens that people today are able to have free public education. Thaddeus Stevens understood that education was a way to have opportunity and a way to be free. He was joined in his battle by a U.S. Senator, Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner, in his fight for the rights of and equality for the former slaves and former free people who had lived in slavery and discrimination and prejudice, he fought for them to have equality in America. This angered the Southerners, Southern white legislators and congressmen and senators so much that one of them took his cane and beat Charles Sumner back so badly that Charles Sumner was unconscious, and it took him 3 years to overcome the wounds and the beating that he took on the floor of the U.S. Congress. The fact that he fought so hard for education for black people, the education for formerly enslaved people, means that throughout this nation, even today, there are any number of schools, many of them once segregated all-black schools, that are named for Charles Sumner. We turn now to Mother Mary Elizabeth Lang. As we learn about her efforts to educate little black children, we will find out why she exemplifies and represents the idea that being literate means being free.
Decades before slavery was abolished, a free woman immigrated to the U.S. and opened her home to educate children of color, laying the foundation for what would become the country's first black Catholic school. Elizabeth Lang was born in a Haitian community in Santiago de Cuba circa 1794. By 1812, she and some of her family left Cuba and settled in Baltimore, Maryland. After a decade of living in the States, Lang saw that the children in her community had no access to education and no way to get ahead. She became involved in missionary work and opened her home to teach young girls. Public education was not yet available to any children, let alone the children of slaves. This became St. Francis School for Colored Girls, the country's first black Catholic school. The next year, Elizabeth became a nun and took the name Mary, and with 3 other sisters, she founded the Oblate Sisters of Providence, the first religious order created and sustained by Afro women in the Americas. The Oblate Sisters' main mission was to teach, but over the years, they dedicated themselves to serving the community. They took in the sick and dying, sheltered widows and homeless women, and provided adult education and career training. To continue their missionary work, the sisters begged on the streets, made and sold altar cloths, and organized fairs. By the mid-20th century, Oblate Sisters were teaching in 16 states across the US and in Cuba. Mother Mary Lang died in 1882, but her work continues. The school she founded still stands after 190 years, and 99% of its graduates attend college. As an immigrant, as a free woman in a slave state, and as a Catholic in a Protestant country, Mary Lang faced many odds, but none that could shake her faith. Because of her life's work, Mother Mary Lang may go down as the first Afro-American saint in Catholic history.
Not only were there people who believed in education to the point that they would become educators themselves, there were also people who understood the power of education so well that they were willing to build institutions for the purpose of educating others. Such a person was Mary McLeod Bethune from Florida. So there is a definite Florida connection to this woman of education. Mary McLeod Bethune started a school that still exists today, Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona Beach, Florida. Today it is Bethune-Cookman University, but it traces its roots, its founding, and its purpose to the great Mary McLeod Bethune. Like Mary McLeod Bethune, Booker T. Washington understood that education was so important to the freedom and advancement of colored people that he too built an institution. He built Tuskegee Institute, today known as Tuskegee University, located in Alabama. Booker T. Washington believed so much in education that he and his students made the bricks that were used to build Tuskegee Institute. And they were the ones who put that school together from the ground up. Booker T. Washington also understood the importance of recruiting accomplished faculty. So it was the person standing next to him, George Washington Carver, who was recruited to serve at Tuskegee in the agricultural department. And together, Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver educated a generation of young people who have made their mark on the United States of America, who have made their mark on history, not just of America, but of the world, through the power, the understanding, the achievement, the commitment of a Booker T. Washington and a George Washington Carver. James Weldon Johnson, from Jacksonville, Florida, is best known for his writing of Lift Every Voice and Sing, the song that came to be known as the Negro National Anthem and today the Black National Anthem. James Weldon Johnson, therefore, was a man who understood the power of words, the power of writing, the power of literature, the power of the spoken word, the power of written expression, and therefore the power of education to lift as we climb, to lift raising our voices, to lift fighting for freedom against oppression, freedom against, and a victory, he called it, over discrimination, over inequity, over injustice, and victory for what words and education and literacy and being literate can mean in making this world an uplifting place where we lift our voices and sing. Slavery became such an issue in America, in the United States of America, that its citizens were willing to go to war over the issue of slavery. You had the United States of America versus the Confederate States of America. You had the Union Army versus the Rebel Army. You had the Blues versus the Grays. And you had black citizens or black people who were a part of the United States as slaves, who were a part of the United States as free people, who were not given the rights of citizenship or equality or any of those things that we fight for and feel we deserve. Those blacks were willing to fight against the effort to keep them enslaved by joining forces. Some of the black men became soldiers in the Union Army, and they fought for their freedom. Women, too, played a great role in fighting in the Civil War, in helping in the war effort. White women like Miss Van Loo, who had a spy network, and she recruited people for her spy network in support of the Union Army or in support of the United States of America. One of those spies, one of those people that she recruited to become a spy was Mary Elizabeth Bowser. Miss Van Loo not only recruited her for her spy network, she educated her. As a Quaker, her family, her mother, and Miss Van Loo sent Mary to school to learn to read and write, to become literate. They understood that being literate meant being free. And with her ability to read and write, Mary was placed as a spy in the Confederate White House of Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis had no respect for a black woman in his home working as what he saw a virtual slave, being able to read and write. So he put no restrictions on her. So Mary would be in what would be considered to be the war room, his office, sweeping and dusting and reading and spying. So she could report to the spy network where the where the Confederate troops were. She could report how many of them there were, what would be their next campaign. She could report all of those things that the Union Army needed and that President Lincoln needed and that the generals needed to be able to win the war for the United States of America. Mary's being literate helped Mary and many of her people to become free.